It happened at 2:47 a.m. The shrill alarm on Uncle Franklin's oxygen tank shattered the silence like a thunderclap. I bolted out of bed, racing toward the RV beside our house, barefoot on cold pavement, heart pounding louder than the siren. Through the fogged window, I saw him slump sideways in his seat, clawing at the tube near his nose, eyes wide with panic. I yanked the door open, and the smell of ozone and plastic hit me just before I reached him. His lips were turning blue. The tank showed zero pressure, empty. I slammed the backup valve open, praying it would work, and it did, barely. Franklin gasped like he'd been underwater too long. While paramedics loaded him up minutes later, I reviewed the security camera I had installed just last week. That's when I saw her. HOA President Karen, black gloves, scissors, smiling. She cut the oxygen line like she was snipping a birthday ribbon. That's when I knew this wasn't just harassment anymore. This was war. When I moved back into my childhood home, I didn't expect to relive high school politics. Yet somehow, the HOA here made those cafeteria cliques look like summer camp. I'd moved in to take care of my Uncle Franklin, a Vietnam veteran and retired Special Forces medic, after he suffered a mild stroke that left him partially paralyzed. He preferred his independence, though, and insisted on living in his fully modified RV parked next to the house. Medical exemption paperwork filed. ADA approvals cleared. City permits all stamped. But none of that mattered to the self-declared queen of the cul-de-sac. Karen had a reputation before I'd even unpacked my boxes. Watch out, one neighbor warned while handing me a stale welcome muffin. She once fined a guy for painting his fence a shade too cheerful. Another whispered, she measures lawn height with a ruler. And they weren't joking. On day 3, I got a citation for excessive flagpole usage because Franklin flew a military service flag next to the American one. That was the beginning. The first time Karen came face to face with Uncle Franklin, she marched over like she was on an important mission herself. She wore sunglasses even though it was cloudy and carried a clipboard like it was an official warrant. She didn't even glance at me. She looked straight at Franklin, reclined in his wheelchair near the RV's ramp, and said, "This vehicle is a community eyesore. I need you to remove it within 72 hours. Franklin, as calm as ever, gave her a slow nod. You can talk to the city. They'd got the paperwork, and maybe read the ADA while you're at it. She huffed and pivoted like she was on a runway. Rules are rules, she muttered. And don't expect special treatment just because of costumes. Costumes. That's what she called his uniform, hanging in a shadow box by the RV window. In the weeks that followed, Karen escalated things. We received 4 separate citations for things that didn't exist. Improper lighting configuration on our front porch, unauthorized yard ornamentation because of a small eagle statue, vehicle parked improperly when my sedan was neatly in the driveway. She even sent someone to measure the distance between the sidewalk and the RV's entry ramp. But Franklin never blinked. He just watched, shook his head, and kept reading the paper while his oxygen hissed softly beside him. Then came the first real scare. One morning, I found the RV's side window open and the oxygen dial turned halfway. I asked Franklin if he'd done it. He hadn't. We installed a lock the next day and put up a small camera facing the RV. That camera, cheap, battery-powered, and stuck with tape to a gutter, would end up capturing the footage that made my blood run cold. I didn't even check it until after the incident. That night, I had fallen asleep earlier than usual after helping Franklin refill his tank. Everything had seemed normal. Then the alarm jolted me awake. The paramedics said his vitals were weak but stabilizing. They asked if the tank had malfunctioned. I didn't know what to say until I opened the camera app and scrolled back. The footage started at 2:41 a.m. and showed someone walking briskly up our side yard in a hoodie, ducking under the motion sensor. As she approached the RV, her face turned toward the tiny security light above the door. And that's when I saw it. Karen, no mistake. The same high cheekbones, same stiff jawline, and those unmistakable overplucked eyebrows. She reached into her coat and pulled out something silver. Then she bent down, snipped the main oxygen line, and walked away casually. No panic, no urgency, just that smug little smirk like she just crossed off another to-do list item. I don't think I've ever been more shocked. The next morning, I marched to the HOA office, phone in hand, ready to show the footage to the HOA board. But Karen wasn't there. Her assistant, a man named Dove who looked like he'd been emotionally pressured into volunteering, told me she was on a retreat for neighborhood wellness. I laughed in disbelief and left. That's when I realized Karen didn't care about rules. She cared about power, and she didn't think anyone would stand up to her, especially not an old man in a wheelchair and his nephew who still had moving boxes in the garage. What she didn't know was that Uncle Franklin wasn't just some old veteran. He had stories backed up by medals, newspaper clippings, and a chest full of field journals. He had connections, friends in the military, press, even government. And most importantly, he had me, a tech-savvy ex-journalist with a grudge and a fully charged social media following. If she wanted a quiet life of petty fines and community bake sales, she picked the wrong veteran. That night, I clipped the video and added subtitles. I didn't scream or accuse in the captions. I just let the footage speak. I uploaded it with one line. This is what HOA abuse looks like. By morning, the video had over 70,000 views. By afternoon, local reporters were calling. And by dinner, a national veterans rights group had reached out offering legal support and a PR campaign. Karen had no idea the storm that was about to hit her, but I did. I was going to make sure the world knew what she did, not just because it nearly cost my uncle his life, but because if we let people like Karen win, next time it might be someone who doesn't have a backup tank, a camera, or a nephew who refuses to back down. And that was something I couldn't live with. The day after the video exploded online, Uncle Franklin sat in the RV, sipping coffee through a stainless steel straw, his oxygen line properly connected and humming quietly beside him. Despite the chaos, he looked strangely calm. Maybe it was because he had faced worse. Maybe it was because he saw what I was planning. Or maybe, deep down, he knew that Karen had finally overplayed her hand. The news vans started rolling in by 10 o'clock a.m., first the local ones, then some regional affiliates. They wanted interviews, on-camera statements, background footage, anything. I tried to shield Franklin from the frenzy, but he surprised me. He asked for his green Army-issue windbreaker, had me shine his boots, and then said, "Let's give them a show, kid." The interview took place on our front lawn, the same HOA lawn Karen had cited for having an unauthorized decorative rock. The crew wired Franklin up, clipped a microphone to his collar, and let the camera roll. The reporter asked soft questions at first, basic ones about what happened, his military background, how he ended up here. But then she asked, "Do you think this was personal?" Franklin gave a small laugh, like he'd been waiting for the real question. Then he leaned forward and said, "Lady, I've been shot at, bombed, and hunted by people who didn't know my name. At least they were honest enemies. Karen," he smiled at me, while planning to take my breath away. "That's a special kind of evil." That line went viral before the interview even aired. Overnight, comments flooded in from all over the country. Veterans, nurses, disability advocates, people from HOA-run communities who had similar stories. Everyone had something to say. The video views passed 1 million, then 2. Karen's name began trending. A screenshot from the footage, showing her crouched next to the oxygen line with scissors, became a meme. One person captioned it, "This oxygen line violates neighborhood aesthetics." Another wrote, "Karen making sure the weak don't ruin the property value." Back in our neighborhood, reactions were mixed. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, clearly nervous. A few rang our doorbell and brought casseroles, apologies, or handshakes. One man, former Navy, left a folded note under our mat that just read, "Respect, Chief." But others still clung to their loyalties. A small group of Karen's die-hard supporters claimed the video was edited, that it didn't show the full context, and that HOAs have rules for a reason. That was fine. We weren't trying to convince everyone, just the right people. Karen, meanwhile, had vanished. Her house looked dark. No jogs around the block, no clipboard marches. The HOA office was temporarily closed for restructuring. but the damage control attempts were only just beginning. On the third day after the incident, a formal statement was issued from the HOA's official email, claiming the footage was doctored to misrepresent intent, and that Karen was simply inspecting a potential hazard to protect community safety. They used phrases like out of context, personal agenda, and ongoing investigation. It didn't help their case. In fact, it made things worse, because what they didn't know was that we weren't alone. Uncle Franklin had contacts, people he hadn't spoken to in years, but who owed him favors or still respected the uniform he wore. One of them was his old squad mate, Daniel, now a retired JAG attorney who specialized in veterans affairs. When Daniel heard what happened, he didn't ask permission. He flew in. The moment he arrived, he hugged Franklin and said, "Looks like we've got ourselves another mission." That same afternoon, we began drafting legal notices. The first was for reckless endangerment. The second was for willful discrimination under ADA statutes. The third was for HOA bylaw violations, harassment, and personal damages. And it wasn't just aimed at Karen. It was aimed at the entire board that supported her silence. While Daniel prepared the legal side, I doubled down on the media front. I set up a live stream key and a session with Uncle Franklin for a veteran-focused podcast. The host was a former Army Ranger with a huge following, and once he heard Franklin's story, he didn't hold back. During the stream, Franklin explained how he had earned his Purple Heart in Cambodia, pulling 3 wounded teammates from a burning APC, how he built makeshift field hospitals using tarps and rusted crates, how he survived malaria twice. The host asked, "After all that, how does it feel being attacked in your own neighborhood?" Franklin answered, "Honestly, it's the first time I felt betrayed on my own soil." That line sent the chat into overdrive. Donations poured in. Lawyers, reporters, even politicians started reaching out. But Karen wasn't done yet. From the shadows, she launched a new tactic: legal threats. We received a cease and desist letter from her private attorney, claiming defamation, slander, and emotional damage. The letter demanded we take down all videos, issue a public apology, and compensate her for lost reputation. Daniel laughed when he read it. "She wants you to apologize for saving your uncle's life. Let's file this under delusional and send her a counter notice." We did exactly that, along with a letter of our own, backed by documented ADA exemptions, surveillance footage, and medical records proving just how reckless her actions were. The tension in the neighborhood thickened like summer heat. One afternoon, while unloading groceries, a woman from the HOA board approached me. Her name was Sharon, one of Karen's longtime allies. She looked nervous, holding a pie in one hand and a manila folder in the other. "I didn't know she'd actually cut it," she whispered, glancing around. "I thought she was just bluffing. Please don't sue me too." I took the pie and said nothing. The next morning, she resigned from the board and posted a handwritten apology in the community mailbox area. By now, the story had gone from viral video to national scandal. A late-night talk show host even made a joke about it during his monologue. In Florida, an HOA president tried to cut a veteran's oxygen line. But don't worry, she's now breathing into a paper bag from the backlash. The audience roared. Franklin didn't laugh, but he smiled. And I knew we were winning. Not with threats, not with fists, with truth, with exposure, with evidence. But we weren't finished. Because as powerful as public outrage was, it wouldn't change anything unless someone was held accountable. And that was coming next. 3 days after Karen's cease and desist letter arrived, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into our driveway. For a second, I thought maybe one of the more aggressive HOA supporters had decided to escalate things. But then the back door opened, and out stepped a man in a blue suit with a silver lapel pin shaped like an eagle. His name was Michael Torres, a federal mediator sent by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Apparently, when our video began circulating among advocacy circles, it reached the inbox of someone in Washington who didn't take kindly to disabled veterans being harassed and nearly killed over housing code violations. Torres shook Uncle Franklin's hand, introduced himself with firm calmness, and requested to tour the property and see the original medical permits. He didn't come for a photo op. He came to document a case of civil rights abuse. While Torres and Daniel reviewed documents inside the RV, a separate storm was brewing down at the HOA clubhouse. Karen had returned, not to apologize, not to explain, but to call an emergency meeting of the HOA board. She arrived in her signature visor, oversized sunglasses, and white cardigan, like she was attending a tennis match instead of facing potential criminal charges. She walked straight past a group of silent neighbors gathered outside the clubhouse steps, ignoring their stares and whispered remarks. Inside, she announced sweeping new community safety regulations, effective immediately. No exterior medical equipment visible from the street. No overnight parking of non-commercial vehicles. No exceptions for personal preference or unverifiable conditions. She didn't say Uncle Franklin's name, but everyone knew. Word spread within hours. People who hadn't cared much before suddenly realized that these new rules would affect more than just us. Elderly residents with oxygen tanks, mobility scooters, and dialysis setups were now under threat. Parents of children with medical conditions called emergency meetings. One man in the neighborhood who used a stairlift to enter his home wrote an open letter to the HOA saying, "If my son's life support is now considered non-compliant, then maybe this board has lost its soul." The letter was printed and taped to every mailbox. Karen didn't back down. Instead, she made things worse. She hired a private security company, plain clothes but armed with batons and radios, to begin issuing warnings to violators. Within the first 24 hours, 3 citations were handed out, one for a power wheelchair charger too close to the curb, one for a van-mounted oxygen tank visible through a window, and one to a cancer patient for having a backup generator behind his home. People began to panic. Others started filming. A mother screamed at a security guard who told her she needed to remove the lift in her front yard. That video went viral too. And once again, Karen's face, cold, firm, and expressionless, became the symbol of suburban cruelty. Meanwhile, our legal team went to work. Daniel filed a motion for an injunction against the HOA's new rules on grounds of federal housing discrimination. Backed by Torres's testimony and our surveillance footage, the case was fast-tracked. A court date was scheduled for 2 weeks out, but we weren't waiting until then. I knew Karen would try to spin the narrative again, so I worked overnight on another video. This one wasn't just about Uncle Franklin. It was about all the residents being affected. I interviewed 3 neighbors. An elderly widow with COPD, a dad whose daughter used a ventilator, and a man recovering from a recent surgery who needed a portable IV drip. Each of them spoke softly, clearly, and with quiet dignity about how these HOA rules were making them feel like criminals for simply trying to survive. The video hit hard. Over 6 million views in 3 days. Hashtags like #HOAHorrors and #BreathFree started trending. A national cable network reached out and requested exclusive rights to do a long-form documentary on the situation. Uncle Franklin declined but allowed them to use excerpts. Then came the bombshell. A former board member, a woman named Patricia who had resigned months ago citing personal burnout, posted her own video explaining how Karen had ignored multiple legal memos warning her that targeting medical setups could trigger ADA violations. Patricia had emails, timestamps, even audio of Karen mocking residents in a board meeting, saying things like, "They'll whine about disability rights until someone reminds them they live in my neighborhood." That recording played during the 6:00 p.m. news. Public opinion flipped like a switch. Karen finally responded on her terms. She posted a pre-recorded video of herself sitting at her kitchen table, surrounded by plastic flowers and a prominently displayed HOA logo. In the video, she claimed she had acted in the community's best interest and that the attention was being driven by a coordinated smear campaign led by a small group of online agitators. She didn't address the footage of her cutting the oxygen line. She didn't apologize. She didn't even mention Uncle Franklin. Instead, she talked about property values, standards, and the silent majority that supported her. That video was downvoted into oblivion and reposted with memes before the night was over. One comment read, "Did she just gaslight an actual war hero?" But Karen's actions weren't just backfiring online. They were fracturing her base. At the next HOA board meeting, held in a local church hall because the clubhouse was being swarmed with press. 2 of the remaining 5 board members publicly resigned. One cited a conflict of conscience. The other simply said, "This isn't why I joined the HOA." During the meeting, Karen attempted to push through a motion to retroactively authorize her rule changes. A dozen residents stood up and booed. Someone threw a shoe. She ended the meeting abruptly, announcing, "You'll thank me later when this neighborhood still has dignity." Outside, I stood next to Franklin, who had insisted on attending in his uniform, the same one Karen once referred to as a costume. Reporters circled. Flashbulbs popped. A child walked up and saluted Franklin without a word. He returned it quietly. I whispered, "You ready for the next step?" He didn't blink. "Son, I've marched into jungle fire. I can handle a homeowner with a grudge." Then came the subpoena. Karen was formally served at her home while watering her rose bushes. A neighbor caught the moment on video. She dropped the watering can, read the envelope, and yelled something unintelligible before slamming the door. That video trended for hours. The lawsuit listed 8 federal and state violations. Our legal team was prepared. The residents were rallying. The media was watching. And Karen? She was cornered, furious, and running out of excuses. Her HOA kingdom, built on fear and cetaceans, was finally starting to crumble, and we weren't finished until it was dust. The week leading up to the court date felt like the calm before a storm. But everyone in the neighborhood knew it wasn't peace. It was pressure. You could feel it in the air, in the way people walked a little faster past Karen's house, in the way whispers traveled faster than sound. Even the local kids seemed quieter, as if instinctively sensing the tension mounting around them. Karen's house, once a social hub for HOA loyalists and passive-aggressive lawn tea parties, now looked like a bunker. Curtains drawn, lights rarely on, and the security patrol she hired still aimlessly circled the block like mall cops with something to prove. They parked near our home twice a night, sitting silently for 15 minutes, probably hoping to intimidate us. It had the opposite effect. Uncle Franklin, on more than one occasion, rolled up to them in his wheelchair and offered them coffee. They always declined. On a cloudy Thursday morning, a large white van pulled into the street and parked across from the HOA clubhouse. The logo on the side read Veterans Advocacy Foundation. Inside were 3 former officers and 2 lawyers, all coming to meet with Uncle Franklin and observe the neighborhood in person. Their arrival was symbolic. These weren't protesters or politicians. These were people who served, who understood what it meant when someone like Karen weaponized bureaucracy against the very people who had once fought to protect it. Their presence turned up the heat. Reporters were everywhere. Microphones shoved toward residents. Camera crews camped on curbs. Drones buzzed above. Karen remained out of sight, but the board announced a town hall meeting to clear the air and offer transparency. No one believed them. Still, everyone showed up. The community hall was packed. Every folding chair was taken, and dozens more stood along the walls or peered through the glass doors. The room buzzed with whispers and murmurs as HOA board members took their seats. Karen entered late, flanked by 2 security guards, wearing her usual white blazer and her signature, "I'm calm but annoyed" face. She sat without acknowledging anyone. The board's vice president, now clearly uncomfortable being associated with her, tapped the mic and began, "We're here tonight to listen. We know there have been misunderstandings, miscommunications." Before he could continue, someone stood up from the crowd. It was a middle-aged woman named Jennifer, whose son relied on a breathing machine at night. She held up a photo of her child sleeping next to his machine and said, "This isn't a misunderstanding. This is targeted cruelty." Applause erupted. Another resident followed, reading aloud from HOA emails where Karen referred to problem homes with visible medical junk. More gasps. Then an older man near the back raised his hand and simply said, "You cut a veteran's oxygen line. What part of that are we supposed to misunderstand?" Karen stood, microphone in hand, and cleared her throat. "I never cut any line," she began. The footage was ambiguous, the context missing. I was ensuring safety. The RV had exposed hoses. Anyone could have tripped. And frankly, we must maintain standards. This community was built on order. People started yelling, booing. Someone shouted, "Standards don't mean suffocation." A man near the front row yelled, "You call that order? We call it attempted harm." The guards flinched but didn't move. Karen held her ground. "This meeting is not a trial," she said sternly. "It's a discussion." That's when I stepped forward, holding a large tablet, and asked for permission to show a short clip. Reluctantly, the board agreed. I played a 15-second enhanced version of the security footage, zoomed, color-corrected, and stabilized. It showed Karen, clearly identifiable, kneeling by the oxygen line, scissors in hand, slicing through the hose with deliberate precision. The room fell dead silent. No one moved. No one breathed. When the clip ended, I looked directly at her. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's you with a weapon, cutting off a disabled veteran's lifeline." Karen stared at the screen, then at me, and then down at her hand. For the first time, she looked smaller, not physically, but in presence, diminished, vulnerable in the way only people caught red-handed ever are. She tried to speak, but the room had already decided. There was no coming back from that moment. The board called a recess, clearly shaken. Karen stormed out, flanked by her guards again, but this time she wasn't strutting. She was retreating. The following morning, the front page of the local paper read, "HOA leader faces backlash over veterans' oxygen sabotage." National networks ran the same clip I showed the night before. The footage was no longer a neighborhood rumor. It was undeniable evidence. The veterans group issued a public statement calling for criminal charges. Franklin received a formal letter of support, signed by over 50 retired military officials and a dozen members of Congress. The HOA board scrambled to hold an emergency vote. The result was unanimous. Karen was suspended indefinitely, pending legal proceedings. But Karen didn't go quietly. That evening, she held her own press conference on her front lawn. A few loyalists stood behind her with crossed arms and awkward expressions. She began by claiming she was the real victim, that she'd been harassed, filmed without consent, publicly shamed, that her actions were misrepresented by a manipulative campaign from anti-HOA radicals. The reporters weren't buying it. They asked why she hadn't denied being in the video, why she'd filed rule changes targeting disabled residents, why she had deleted several emails and private HOA communications after the incident. She stammered, then walked off mid-question. That clip went viral too. The next day, HOA enforcement completely halted. No citations, no patrols. The private security firm quietly withdrew its personnel after citing contract violations. The neighborhood was still tense, but now it felt like recovery had started. People began speaking more freely, waving again, gathering in small clusters on lawns to talk about what they'd witnessed. Several residents who had once supported Karen came forward with their own stories about bullying, threats, and rule bending used to enforce her will. One woman confessed that Karen had once threatened to foreclose on her home if she didn't vote a certain way in an HOA election. That story was already being picked up by a state investigative team. Meanwhile, our court date remained firm on the calendar. But we weren't just relying on the law anymore. We were laying the groundwork for something bigger. Uncle Franklin began talks with the veterans group and civil rights lawyers about pushing for statewide reforms in HOA regulations. A petition started online demanding federal oversight for HOAs that handle medically vulnerable residents. Thousands signed within a week. This was no longer about one street, one community, or even one incident. It had become a movement. Karen's days of control were done. Her smugness had turned to silence, her power into isolation, and as I watched her once pristine lawn fill with dead leaves and dust, it felt poetic, like her kingdom of clipped hedges and iron rules had finally withered. She had tried to cut off a man's oxygen. Instead, she'd cut her own legacy to pieces, and we weren't done making sure everyone saw the wreckage. The courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers and journalists, but with neighbors, veterans, advocacy group representatives, and ordinary people who had followed the story from thousands of miles away. Some came in wheelchairs, some with service dogs, others holding handmade signs of support for Uncle Franklin. The judge had to request silence 3 separate times before the opening arguments even began. Karen sat stiffly at the defendant's table, her trademark blazer exchanged for a drab gray suit that looked 2 sizes too large. She wasn't flanked by security this time. She was alone, staring down at a yellow legal pad, pretending to take notes but clearly unraveling by the second. Her lawyer, a nervous man with slicked back hair and too much cologne, tried to appear confident, but even he knew the footage was damning, the public sentiment worse, and the courtroom energy lethal for their case. Daniel opened our side with a calm, authoritative voice. He didn't need theatrics. He had truth, footage, medical records, and precedent. He walked the court through the sequence of events with methodical precision, playing the video again, submitting documents from the VA showing ADA exemptions filed long before the incident. Then he called Uncle Franklin to the stand. The courtroom hushed as Franklin wheeled himself forward, dressed not in his uniform, but in a simple black shirt with his service pins carefully aligned across the left side of his chest. His voice was steady, if slower than it used to be, but each word landed like a drumbeat. He explained the necessity of his oxygen system, the security measures we took, the night he nearly died. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't even sound angry, just disappointed, like a teacher recounting a student's worst mistake. When Karen's lawyer cross-examined, he attempted to paint the incident as a misunderstanding, suggesting the hose may have already been damaged, or that Karen was confused about its purpose. Franklin looked the man dead in the eye and said, "If someone's confused about an oxygen line labeled medical, do not touch. They shouldn't be in charge of a lemonade stand, let alone a neighborhood." Laughter rippled through the courtroom before the judge banged the gavel for silence. Even the bailiff cracked a smile. Then came the parade of testimonies. The father of a disabled daughter who received a citation after Karen's new rule. The elderly widow who feared leaving her generator out for her breathing machine. The woman who had resigned from the HOA after being pressured to vote against exemptions. One by one, they painted the same picture, an HOA gone rogue, led by a woman obsessed with control at any cost. By the end of the 3rd day, Karen looked visibly shaken. Her lawyer had stopped objecting. He barely spoke. On the 4th day, the judge delivered the ruling. It was swift, direct, and unforgiving. Karen and the HOA were found liable for intentional infliction of emotional distress violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Reckless endangerment civil harassment damages were awarded not only to Uncle Franklin, but to several other residents who had suffered under her illegal rule changes. The HOA was ordered to pay restitution, cover legal fees, undergo a complete leadership restructuring under federal oversight for the next 2 years. Karen herself was fined, barred from holding any future HOA or board leadership positions, referred to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. The moment the gavel hit the block, the room erupted. Applause, tears, hugs. Uncle Franklin sat quietly through it all, smiling softly but not celebrating. Later, when we stepped outside surrounded by reporters, he said something that would make the headlines again. This wasn't about revenge. It was about breath, about dignity. You don't have to put on a uniform to earn respect. But if you take someone's oxygen and expect silence, you're not dealing with a neighborhood. You're dealing with a nation of people who don't forget. That line would echo across social media, etched into videos, shared in tributes. Veterans groups held fundraisers in Franklin's name. Disabled rights organizations asked for his help drafting new policies. He declined the spotlight but agreed to help however he could from home. As for Karen, she vanished. Some said she moved out of the neighborhood in the dead of night, packing her belongings into a U-Haul and refusing to look anyone in the eye. Others said she stayed a few more days, holed up in her house as neighbors walked by in awkward silence or full-blown celebration. Her lawn, once the symbol of her obsession with perfection, grew wild. Weeds poked through her flower beds. The once straight hedge became patchy and brown. No one offered to help. The silence around her home became a statement louder than any protest. A few weeks later, the HOA sent out its first newsletter under new leadership. The opening letter acknowledged the past, apologized without defensiveness, and announced plans to involve residents in drafting future regulations. A town hall was scheduled, not for enforcement, but for healing. Uncle Franklin was invited to speak but declined. Instead, he asked that the group hold a barbecue fundraiser for a local veterans shelter. They did. Hundreds attended. It was the first time in years people from the neighborhood had laughed together in one place without fear of being fined for the volume. The RV stayed, not just because it was legal, not just because of the ruling, but because it had become a symbol. Someone even placed a small American flag in the ground next to it, and no one touched it. Kids started riding their bikes near our house again. People walked their dogs and waved. Strangers stopped by just to shake Franklin's hand. He never refused, though sometimes he'd just nod and say, "Glad you stopped by, son." Months passed. The press moved on. The hashtags faded, but the change stuck. Rules were rewritten. Neighbors checked in on each other. And the threat of Karen, of being watched or punished for simply existing, dissolved like mist under a strong morning sun. In many ways, we'd won more than a legal battle. We'd reclaimed our community. One afternoon, I found Franklin sitting quietly on the porch, sipping his usual coffee, staring at the yard. I asked him if he ever thought we'd come out the other side of this. He shrugged and said, "The thing about bullies is they always think silence is consent, but you make just enough noise and the whole world hears you." He tapped the side of his oxygen tank and smiled. Sometimes all it takes is one good breath to blow the whole house of cards down. And with that, he sat back, tilted his chair, and let the breeze wash over his face. Peace had returned, and it was earned.